Hi, this is Paul. I am trying something new. I am not in my office, as you can see, but I am in New England. Um, we're doing getting together with some family for Thanksgiving, and I thought I'd try to make a video. I'm doing it with a laptop camera. I have a laptop that, when I picked the laptop, I tried to have a pretty good camera with it. It's obviously not of the quality of the cameras as you're used to, and I'm trying to do it with a microphone. It's not of the quality you're used to, but I'm curious to see how the quality will turn out. Just because I make a trip and work away from home doesn't mean I don't think about the things that I'm always thinking about. I'll see if, and I'm trying to record this in StreamYard because that seems to be a way that I can do it, and we'll see how this goes. Before I left the office, the conversation between Alex O'Connor and Ayaan Hirsi Ali dropped, and Glenn Scrivener had just recently made a video about Alex O'Connor and sort of trying to get this set up right. I'm so dyslexic, and when I'm dyslexic, the back and forth just, I never seem to get the thing right. There we go. That's, I guess, pretty good. Glenn Scrivener did an interesting video on the changes in Alex O'Connor and how Alex O'Connor really is sort of come into his own, continuing to be, and well, he's an agnostic really more than an atheist. He's the education that he got at Oxford. He decided to study theology and philosophy, and the changes that he's made in terms of his perspective on all of this has been dramatic. Now, that made his conversation with Ayaan Hirsi Ali even more dramatic because, of course, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has had a 180-degree change in terms of where she stands with respect to religion. And that transformation has been fascinating. The whole video is well worth your seeing, but all the way to the end, the last question I thought was really quite amazing.
A final question for you. I asked you earlier what you might have said to Christopher Hitchens, if you could go back in time or bring him here today. I've asked you what you would say to my atheist listeners or to other Christians. Just on a personal level, if you could go back in time and speak to atheist Ayaan, what would Christian Ayaan say to atheist Ayaan 10 years ago?
Christianity is radically different from Islam. Christianity is unique. Everything I love and care about Western society and Western civilization is a product of Christianity. And I would have then said to Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, all of my atheist friends, how do you square this? Why would you be throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Is there nothing you want to retain?
The baby out with the holy water.
With the holy water, yeah. Yeah. And I think I would have also been, I would have paid more attention to the Christian apologists at the time who were debating all of these things. And, I owe them a huge apology. And I think a lot of us owe them a huge apology.
Mm. Well, Ayaan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your story. As you say, this is a work in progress, and there'll be a book at some point when it's ready detailing more of what brought you to faith. But I appreciate that it's still somewhat up in the air. You're still learning, and so I appreciate all the more that you're willing to sit down and talk about it.
I'll bring sort of more concise answers and more well thought through answers than at this stage of discovery where I am in now.
I think there's something wonderful about capturing that moment. I mean, it will be great once you have a thought out theology and you've picked your denomination and you're condemning everyone else as a heretic or whatever it is that.
Now, write that point right there and that little piece right there. Some people might, when listening to this conversation with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, because she's made this dramatic change, you might think that, Oh, in this conversation, I am going to get all of the truly slam dunk answers to all of the skeptical questions that people bring to Christianity. And you really don't at all. She's not an apologist. She's not a biblical scholar. What she is a witness giving a testimony to how Christianity is making more sense in her life. In our Sunday estuary at Living Stones, we had a really wonderful discussion. We had a brand new visitor, a guest of someone to the estuary who came, and the guy who brought him doesn't go to church, but he comes very faithfully to the estuary, and he brought his friend to this estuary. And it was interesting the kinds of topics that surfaced. One of the topics that came up was the fear among a lot of people with respect to the end of the world and climate change. That was something that came up. And then part of where the conversation, then we also talked about life after death and some of the ideas about how the future shapes us psychologically. And that, for the little next video that I'm going to point to, that is a big part of this. Now, kind of the thesis of this video and the theme of this video is that our religions are basically our operating systems. I've made this point before, and you can go and find if you search on YouTube for a lecture by Tom Holland, basically asking, were the Greeks religious? And if you had a time machine and you went all the way back to the Greek world and you saw their temples and their idols in their temples and their sacrifices, and you saw the Greeks making sacrifices, working the temples, doing all this, you'd see this in the Romans. Now, what has happened, one of the things that I talked to my estuary group about was that the definition, our assumption of what we mean by religious has changed dramatically in the modern period. Tom Holland again made this point that when the British, for example, went to India, the British looked around and thought the Indians were, they were working their religion, but the Indians were just sort of trying to make life work. And the sun's coming up. It's kind of like this half in, half out thing going on right now. But the Indians were sort of trying to make life work. And when, for example, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter for fair winds, he's trying to make life work. I've just started reading Jordan Peterson's book, We Who Wrestle with God, and finding that I enjoy the audiobook more than the written book. That in some ways, listening to the audiobook and reading the book, I'm having two very different experiences with the book. And I'm tending to find the audiobook quite a bit more compelling than the written version of the book, which is very interesting because, again, they sort of live in two worlds. What I loved about the Ayaan Hirsi Ali interview and the question was not so much that she somehow gives us apologetic answers that sort of, slam dunk the atheists. No, that's, I think, part of what is happening right now in the culture with the recession of modernity, with the change of worldview, is that the fantasy that surrounds that type of thinking, this is what Peugeot and Vervaeke talked about. It's even in the teaser of their conversation on YouTube about the place of ritual. John Vervaeke makes the point that these assumptions about putting the world together, about having all of these arguments, amassing evidence, again, it's sort of building the Tower of Babel with facts like Amazon boxes or bricks, that this is how the world is constructed, and anybody who is living in a way whose world isn't constructible, because of course, if you really press someone who believes that that's how one ought to live their life, they would have to very quickly admit that they can't. So what in fact they do is they construct their life on a whole bunch of assumptions that arise from their faith in experts or science or this political group or this philosophical group. And that's sort of this this evidentialism, that's sort of this foundationalism that pretty much gripped modernity. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, like many, many, many others, like just about everyone, basically comes around and says, if you have to ask for evidence, I have all sorts of evidence why I have made the decisions that I have made. The evidence that she had is that living an atheist life gave her nihilism, and nihilism is no fun to live with. And her nihilism provoked depression and drinking a great deal and trying to do all sorts of things. And so the way out of nihilism is, in fact, faith. And are all faiths the same? No, all faiths are not the same. Her experience with Islam is different than her experience with Christianity. Now, again, I can anticipate many of the other responses, let's say by atheists who are feeling defensive or Muslims who are feeling defensive. And that's sort of the word game that we play. And it's just kind of a natural word game that we all play. But the kind of evidence that she has and the kind of testimony that she has is very much like the rest of life. And now, if she has to somehow defend all sorts of things in the Bible that people believe need defending for some reason, and again, all of the things that they pick on, you can watch Richard Dawkins pick on all of these things in his conversation with Jordan Peterson. You have to defend the virgin birth. You have to defend the resurrection. You have to defend the ascension. All sorts of other things that they feel no need to defend are, Jesus said this or Jesus said that. Well, of course, if some of the things that Jesus said seems to lead people to believe that he is something like the Son of God, or anything that touches all of this that they imagine they have to defend, well, then, that whole word game begins again. But what you see in Ayaan Hirsi Ali is just basically a testimony. She says, I tried this way of living. I've got this way of living now. I think this is a better way of living. I'm going to write a book. And I don't think that we're going to find new dramatic apologetic arguments coming out of her book. I think we're probably going to see the testimony of a woman who was raised in a time and place in Africa where Islamism was on the rise and where she found that particular group to be intrusive and not very much to her liking. And so she escapes to Europe, and she finds in Europe this freedom and, in a sense, this sense of liberation and freedom that Western Europe offered. And then she just sort of continued with the liberationism and the freedom to a certain degree, and getting all the way to that point, sort of discovers that, well, you keep following this liberationism to a certain point and you just wind up with nihilism and you wind up with societal breakdown. And so now I'm going to look for a different structure. I'm going to look for more structure. And that's, in fact, what she found. Now, another video that dropped, which was far better than I expected, was Jordan Peterson's conversation with Piers Morgan. Now, I knew that that would be mostly political and mostly about the Trump election. That's sort of how it was baited. And then, of course, it had the most clickbaitable, outrageous title. But some people began sending me messages, said, have you watched the Piers Morgan one? And I said, no, I hadn't, because that sort of was low on my priority because it seemed mostly political. But then I watched it and I really enjoyed it. And for me, what tends to get me is the personal. And that's exactly what sort of got me from the Ayaan Hirsi Ali story and also from this. And very interesting. It seems that Piers Morgan and Jordan Peterson have developed something of a relationship. Now, it's a high status relationship, and both of them are coming to this relationship out of motivation. I'm not saying it's purely motivation because of both of their projects. Piers Morgan, of course, in terms of having a successful media career, as sort of being dramatic and controversial and unfiltered, sort of a counter-narrative media career. And Jordan Peterson, of course, also in some ways as a person who is outside of the blue church, outside of what everybody imagines it would be. And then Piers Morgan gets into the fact that Jordan's parents both died this year. And Jordan mentioned that. I first heard about that. Someone on Twitter mentioned something, and then I heard about it in, I think, his conversation with Jonathan Peugeot. And what I really liked about this conversation was, in fact, Jordan got very personal about his relationship with his father. That touched me. I'm actually sitting in my father's old office and my father's desk and my father's chair, sort of operating as the spare room now for my mother, who lives alone in their condo. And so I found it very touching, and it was amazing how a lot of Jordan's rather unique vocal intonations seemed to come from his father, who had sort of a similar manner of speaking. But it was a lovely testimony to his father. And then Piers Morgan. So Jordan, which interview was it recently? Jordan makes the comment, which one was it? It was Jordan makes the comment about, the evangelicals who sort of, the religious fundamentalists who sort of push him. Piers Morgan makes the very audacious, gutsy move of, okay, we're going to talk about the loss of your father and the importance of fatherhood, how your father shaped you, how you formed you. And then Piers Morgan says, basically, what do you think? I mean, you've sort of been on, you've let's not say on the fence, because I don't think that's exactly where Jordan is. I think Jordan is much more in his own space, but he's been agnostic about certain conventional aspects of, let's say, the conventional Christianity. And so then basically Piers Morgan sort of puts him on the spot and says, okay, well, what do you think about life after death with respect to your father? That's a big move that Morgan made. And because it's, as I said with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, our religion is for the most part the operating system with which we use to try to make progress in the world. And so, okay, well, what about your father? Now with Jordan, again, there is, on one hand, he's tremendously transparent in that he rightly says, when people ask whether he believes in God, he's sort of like, hey, who's got more hours of talking about this out there than me? Just because he doesn't give a conventional answer, in some ways, possibly apologetically and evangelistically, it's fruitful, because the question just keeps coming up, and not just the political question or the civilizational question, but the personal question with respect to religion. And so the topic of life after death comes up, because it's, and I think it's a great example of the point I made with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that people embrace their religions, or in some ways very much construct their religions, because everybody's religious construction is fairly idiosyncratic. And the more pervasive pluralism there is in a culture, probably the more idiosyncratic people's answers to standard faith questions are going to be. And so Jordan basically gives a fairly agnostic answer to that question, which I think is fitting with many of the other rather agnostic questions he gets to, the afterlife question. And actually, if I was more set up and I had more time, I would probably go into this more with Jordan's conversation with Alex O'Connor, because in that conversation with Alex O'Connor, he gets more into the life after death questions than he usually does in other contexts. Part of what I keep thinking about is also what John Vervaeke said to me when I was pressing John Vervaeke on this topic.
disclosure of realness, but we have lost beauty, and we don't have a reverential attitude towards beauty. In a similar way, we have to understand that there is moral goodness, but in the transcendentals, the moral goodness points to ontological goodness, ontology having to do with the structure of being. Look, people like reality they like reality because it's real. Let me do it one more time. I ask my students, how many of you are in deeply satisfying romantic relationships, our greatest idol replacement and surrogacy for God? How many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you and it would mean the absolute destruction of the relationship? And almost all of them put up their hand. And I asked them.
He uses that example quite a bit. The example has a lot to do with future and our relationship with the future. And so a question about a departed loved one and Christian hope of seeing that person again. Some of you might have noted that I've paused the Heidelberg Catechism series because I'm on Lord's Day 7. Lord's Day 7 pretty specifically gets at the question of Christian exclusivity and life after death. And this is one of the most difficult pastoral care challenges that you have to deal with. And when I finally make this video about Lord's Day 7, you'll see, because I'll lay out just how complex this is. Because part of the difficulty is that there are sort of traps and gotchas on every side. But John Vervaeke's question about, would you like to know if someone is cheating on you, because they love the real and they want the real. But the real, I think, in many ways is almost always attached to a future. And part of what we're bumping into, part of what Jordan keeps bumping into this question of life after death, is how these issues impact us today. And this came up in the estuary group when it is noted that, well, once, let's say, a population of young people believe that the world will end in 20 years, how does that impact the decisions they make today? Well, maybe they don't commit to marriage. Maybe if you do commit to marriage, because I think it's only going to last 20 years, maybe they don't have children. Maybe they don't save their money. And in other words, the future is a very real aspect of today. And whether or not people are consciously thinking about how the future impacts today, it impacts them deeply. Because, for example, I'm visiting my mother because of something that happened. My wife and I changed our plans for Thanksgiving, and we decided to come out here for Thanksgiving to be with my mother. And one of the things that Jordan said in his conversation with Pierce Morgan is that over the last number of years, he counted how often he saw his parents, because he knew that would be a limited number. And actually, that was something that I thought about quite a bit too. And I recognized within myself a certain amount of denial. Before my father died in 2013, part of me thought my father would always be there. Before my sister died in 2018, part of me thought my sister would always be there. And if you would ask me rationally if my father would always be there, I'd say no. That's an irrational thought. But there's assumption within me. And so part of this gets into this really complex question of, to what degree is the future alive within us now? And how do our religious assumptions or our religious convictions impact that future? And basically, how does the future impact the present?
Why? Because it's not real, right? There's a realness, and that's not a moral realness. That's not that's not a moral goodness. That's not an aesthetic, right? It's not even epistemic. It's just, we want realness for its own sake. We want to be connected. That's what I think meaning in life is about. We want to be connected to something bigger because we want to be connected to real.
And I think that bigger, the future, is part of that bigger and part of that realness. I really wonder if we have realness without a vision of a real future.
Reality for its own sake. Nishitani defines religion as the real self-realization of reality, which I think is exactly what I'm trying to talk about here.
The real self-realization of reality. I'm not sure how well that communicates. I understand why it's constructed the way it is. What I like about it is the same reason I squirm is because it's leveraging so much on real. And in many ways, this gets back to my definition of religion, that it is basically the operating system, and in many cases, an idiosyncratic operating system beneath the waterline that we use to try to make life work. Previous video, I made a little tiny clip about this woman's definition of story. A story is how we try to get what we want. And I think in many ways, our religion is how we try to get what we want, or how we try to construct our world. In the estuary group, I talked about, the virtual world making that we do, when we all make these virtual worlds, and our religions are deeply tied to these virtual worlds that we live within, because in some ways, we have to live within a virtual world because of combinatorial explosiveness and all of these things that Peterson talks about as well. Reality is simply too massive and too manifest. So, for example, I went grocery shopping this morning for my mother, and because my wife and I are, cooking some meals and so on and so forth for my mother. And I came back with a few things. One of the things I came back with are little small potatoes. And my mother looked at those and she said, "Well, where did you get those?" I said, "Where are those in the store?" She goes to that store 2-3 times a week. And she says, "It's right there by the potatoes." She says, "I've never seen them." And I forget what else. I brought a treat. I brought some Boston cream donuts home. And my mother's like, I never saw these in the store. Now, she goes to that store very regularly, and her eyesight is fine, and she doesn't have any dementia, and all of that is true. But she never sees those things in the store. Why? Because the store is just too massive, and because what we're always doing is sort of filtering our world according, again, this is the big point that Peterson keeps making. It's the big point that Vervaeke keeps making. We have to construct these worlds. Our world is transjective, and we construct this world. And so we have a hand in creating this world. And in many ways, our religion is a very big part of that construction and that creation.
And I think part of the advent of the sacred, and I see this happening, this is what I was trying to convey with beautiful and glorious, is a re-understanding of beauty as the disclosure of the depths of realness. Appearances not distracting or distorting, but disclosing. Moral goodness as participating in ontological goodness, the very goodness of being that you, Jonathan, and Jordan and I were talking about, and that one of the great claims of Genesis is that reality is just good, right? God pronounces it good before there's any moral beings. Hear that. God pronounces it good before there are any moral beings. It's just good. That's ontological good. And the recovery of truth as
And the point that John just makes is a really important one. I think part of what happens in modernity, especially as deism gets rolling and skepticism gets rolling, in place of God, sort of the functional way that God is in the universe, morality begins to function. I forget who it was on Twitter posted this video of a woman who has a colleague who voted for Trump. And before she found out he voted for Trump, she very much respected him because he was smart and he did science well and all of this. And then when she discovered he voted for Trump, she was just horrendous. And she basically made an argument for his at least marginalization, if not persecution, on the basis of his moral failing. And I remember listening to that and thinking, in many ways, morality becomes the default religion of the skeptic. and the atheist and the agnostic, because once you take the Irenic God out, what I mean by the Irenic God, God number one, this is in many ways, Jordan Peterson is a strange apologist because he doesn't really argue so much for what I call God number two, the agentic God, the God who is acting. He much more argues for the Irenic God, God number one, the God that is present, the God, and I saw this right away with his conversation with Sam Harris, that the arguments that Jordan was making for what God is very much in keeping with Ezekiel Kaufman's idea of revolutionary Hebrew monotheism, that the God of the Hebrews displaces the meta-divine realm that the gods of the pagans inhabited. And so, where was I going with what Vicky was saying? Oh, yeah. So morality, I think in many ways in the modern period, slides in and sort of fills the gap that God number one leaves. Now, in deism and in the clockmaker universe, God number one sort of is pushed back. But then very quickly people realize that if the world is just a series of mechanistic cause and effects under laws of physics and things like this, there's this gap in there, which is morality, because suddenly we realize that not everything we can do, we should do. And so there's sort of this implicit moralistic force that then fills the universe. And then you find basically skeptics and atheists making all sorts of arguments of need and assertion based on some moral principles and moral realism, until, of course, some other skeptics will basically become morally agnostic. And C.S. Lewis points this out in The Abolition of Man and a number of his other books. But then he also points out that all of these skeptics then, on one hand, they'll just declare a lack of morality in the universe, but then they don't live like that, thankfully, and they don't want their neighbors to live like that, predictably.
The etymological word trothing, betrothal, as a deep connectedness, a reciprocal opening, platonic anagogy, all these different ways of recovering the transcendentals, and then through them, like through my glasses, seeing the one behind them, or the good, or the Tao. And I'm also happy to say God behind the transcendentals. I think like we've lost the realness in truth.
And I think when John says, I'm happy to say God behind the transcendentals, again, what I see coming back is the realization of what I call God number one, the realization of the Irenic God. Now, again, God number one is sort of impersonal. And that's where I said right from the start, Christianity is God number one and God number two. Pantheism is just say all God number one and no God number two. But the Christian, the evolutionary theists of the Hebrews who wrote the Bible made this audacious assertion that God both displaces this meta-divine realm that all pagan religions and all the pagan monotheisms assumed, but also acts within the creation that he makes. Now, God is not sort of equal to the creation. The creation is something that God makes, and God pours himself into it. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. He's separate from creation. The whole earth is full of his goodness. It's sort of like asking again, Frodo, can you find Tolkien in Middle Earth? And it's like, well, Tolkien is all around us.
Truth, goodness, and beauty. And we have reduced them all to things that we think we can domesticate with our mechanical methods and manipulations.
And we imagine that they only exist in our experience of them.
That's the fact value dichotomy, and that is absolutely collapsing.
Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me as interesting, of course, Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, where he makes the observation that if you give, and the Matrix makes the same observation, that if you give people a world that many people say they want, I do want all the satisfaction and none of the struggle, that this is a world that we destroy because it is not real. And we have a sense of that. Yet at the same time, you know, part of the narrative of, let's say, the Christian story is you arrive at the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth. And so, you know, one of the things that the biblical images are always evocative. I don't think they're always evocative, but they always leave us sort of wanting more, but somehow unable to flesh out. In other words, you know, I think I was just listening to some James Davidson Hunter, and I've started his book where he's talking about different senses of the Enlightenment, because the French Revolution and the American Revolution weren't the same, and so in the English, I mean, it's all.
Yep.
As we're dealing with the Enlightenment, as we're burrowing down into it, we have to sort of begin to distinguish different expressions of it. But we bought into this idea that this was something that we could manufacture, and we convinced each other that the sacrifices necessary for this were not only necessary but an improvement over the old sacrifices we used to make. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're realizing some of those bargains weren't as real or as true as we thought they would be.
Yeah, I think the Promethean spirit, I mean, what you just gave, Paul, to my ears was a fantastic Orwellian critique of utopias.
Yeah.
Utopia is everything we're talking about on speed. So we can cleave away all the yuckiness, and we can manufacture all the wonderfulness, and it will be wonderful and wonderful and wonderful. And therefore, we can kill millions of people. It starts in the Reign of Terror, right? We can kill millions of people because it's justified, because we will eradicate suffering. So that if you honestly believed that your utopia will eradicate all suffering and bring nothing but unending pleasure and happiness, then that justifies any suffering you inflict right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is why again, on my tombstone, right? Neither nostalgia nor utopia. Right.
So John, my question then is, and please don't, I think we have enough of a relationship now that that I'm not trying to coerce you or twist your arm or anything. It's a good faith, honest question.
Yeah.
Can we generate the kind of desire appropriate for the optimism of the advent of the sacred without a vision of the city four square descending from above? If you go all the way to Paul Kingsnorth talk, and someone, of course, addresses him with the question, the inevitable question from his talk. I don't know if you've listened to it yet, John, or not.
No, I haven't had a chance.
You'll want to listen to it. But again, the Bible ends in a city, and then Paul Kingsnorth says, yes, but it descends from above, and so I mean,
he's right and he's wrong, because the city descends from above, and all the kings of all the nations offer their glory to the city, and so that it's a top down and bottom up process. You can see this. We talk about emanation and emergence. That's the city in the heavenly Jerusalem is described as completely top down and bottom up. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, it just comes from God. It's like, no, it comes from God, and all the kings offer up their best to it, and so it's being built also from below. But it's funny that I think that's why the city on the hill is right. It's eschatological, and it's just not a historical thing. It's not something. It's a new heaven and a new earth. It's not this world, and that's the point. If you make it this world, then seriously, I mean, we all know it's like you after 2 weeks of vacations, you're you're ready to go back. It's like, that's it. I like going on vacation, but at some point I'm done. I'm done with vacation. You know, it's like we need a little bit of friction here. You know, we need a little bit of so I think that the idea of the eschatological vision is the way to go. But sorry, I interrupted your question there, Paul.
Well, and so then the question then I have is how, I don't know, and this goes back. I feel so immensely grateful for the privilege that I've had conversing with you two over the last 5 years. And in some ways, I see how our conversations have progressed, but how we're also continuing to work on where we began working in many ways. Yeah. And so I still think part of what happens in, I don't know if we want to say two worlds mythology, but the eschatological.
So painful watching myself unable to spit out the darn question.
Has to be there. I just read, because Peterson's been talking about Iliad, I just read the
Sacred and the Profane.
The Sacred and the Profane.
Good book.
It is a good book. It is a good book. And of course, in some ways, Charles Taylor gets the realization of the different times. You have, so you need an eschatological vision as part of the overall picture, just like you need the blood and not just clear water. And so I guess my question then is, how does that fit in? Because basically what many of the Enlightenments did was just pretty much cut it off and say, we cannot talk we cannot have an eschatology apart from an immanentized eschatology that becomes utopia.
I want to challenge you on that.
Yeah, good. Please. That's why we're talking.
Yep. And so I think the Enlightenment thought it was doing that. And what the Enlightenment did was just replace the two worlds mythology with a whole bunch of dichotomies. And a dichotomy is not a conceptual distinction that's pragmatically useful. A dichotomy is a deep ontological division. There is the subjective world of value. There's the objective world of fact. There is the mind. There is the body. There is science. There is religion. There is theory and data. I don't think it went away in the Enlightenment. I think it went underground and went unconscious. And it gives us what, by the way, I strongly recommend this book by Frank Gleitzer and my good friend Evan Thompson, The Blind Spot. It put us into we create the worldview from which we do science is not the worldview of science, right? And that is a profound performative contradiction. That's what all those dichotomies do. They put you into the blind spot, just a whole system of performative contradictions. I don't think the Enlightenment cut it off. I think the Enlightenment internalized it in an unconscious and unhealthy way as all of these dichotomies that literally blind us to reality in a profound way. Now, there was obviously a lot of value to the Enlightenment.
And that answer I've really been chewing on and thinking about. I haven't read The Blind Spot yet. I've got all of these books underway right now. But I think he's right. And I think what John says there are these watershed moments that happens in the way we think. And of course, Orrin Barfield got into these quite deeply. And Barfield tried to track these things linguistically. Because of course, spirit and wind used to be one word, and then it was two. And once it became two, we couldn't really make it one again. So that was an example of some of these dichotomies that happen. And part of what I think we struggle with when we use texts that are ancient from other cultures, from other civilizations, are we with the text, we hope to somehow mind read our ancestors. And of course, mind reading is one of these skills that human beings have to a considerable degree, unlike just about anything else we know. And you have to be really careful with this, because a lot of what, let's say, those who hope to save Christianity from modernity, you can look at Boltman, for example, a New Testament scholar. They try to basically demythologize, and so therefore following sort of the breadcrumbs of the Enlightenment, they tried to use physical history as a guide in order to do this. And that project has failed. I think when we talk about the counter-enlightenment or the recession of modernity or post-modernity or meta-modernity, all of these are basically evidences for the failure of the Enlightenment to deliver on its promises. It delivered a lot. It gave us many, many blessings in this world, but it finally couldn't deliver on what it hoped to deliver. And so I think John is right in his challenge to me, but I think that sort of pushes into this question of what do you say to the family, a grieving family surrounding the grave of a loved one? What do you say to a person who has made the sacrifices for community? Do you simply say to them what the Enlightenment basically whispered, but seldom dared to say full out? And I sort of watched T. Grog doing his thing in the comment section, and he's sort of keeping the memory of a certain kind of new atheism alive, which I think is helpful in some ways. But even T. Grog, Sam Harris, none of these people I don't think would go to a funeral and basically say, your loved one is dead. You'll never see them again. Your child is dead. All of the hopes that you had for this child are cut off, never hoping to be fulfilled. All of the sacrifices that one makes and never realizes in this age that they did not live long enough to be fulfilled. Basically, the hope that, say, a passage like Hebrews 11 talks about, all of those promises were lies, and all of what they hoped for were left unfulfilled. Now that doesn't mean, I was thinking about how in traditional societies, people made their sacrifice and lived through the vision of their ancestors. I mean, that's a big part of it. You see that again and again in the Old Testament, about the worst thing you could do to someone was to, for example, the king of Babylon comes and takes, if I remember correctly, Zedekiah to Babylon and kills his sons in front of him and then outs his eyes. So that's the last thing he would see, because the absolute horror is to be cut off. And Abram's horror that he lived with is to not have any descendants. And so it's very real that in the Old Testament people lived through their descendants, and their ancestors lived through them. Okay, how do we process this? How do those achievements live on in us? Now, I don't think there's any question that in the Christian imaginary, this comes to fruit in the resurrection, that then provokes all sorts of debate about the physicality of the resurrection. And I know some Christians might get nervous hearing me talk this way. I'm not a skeptic with respect to the physicality of the resurrection. I think actually Jonathan Pageau makes a good argument for it. And Jonathan Pageau's talk with Peterson with respect to, the virgin birth. I mean, Pageau's basic argument is that you really have to reframe your expectations, not based on, let's say, the scientism that is pervasive, but the broader pictures that in fact have been pervasive and continue to feed the Christian imaginary. And so then to go all the way back to the beginning of the video, because the sun has set and I'm looking over the river that's across the way from my parents' house, and I have to land the plane on this because there will be things to do soon. But the package that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has embraced to counter her deadly nihilism has to be a full package. And whether or not she can answer all of the apologetic or skeptics' challenges doesn't matter. because in a certain sense, the evidence that she has discovered is felt in the life itself. Now, again, I mean, I'm not naive or trying to snow anybody here. I understand that when people say give up the faith, that they're playing a very similar evidential game. But I think part of the delusion of a lot of apologetics games with respect to this is that the evidence lacks the future. Just because embracing this or giving this away or exchanging this for that in terms of their religious worldview seems to solve some problems today, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to continue to solve problems in the future. And part of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's testimony bears witness to that. And I thought it was incredibly poignant when Alex O'Connor then asks that question of her in that way. And I think we as a culture and we as a civilization are going to keep knocking on these doors. And the kinds of things that we're dealing with here are very much in that way. I think we found New Atheism to be sort of a fever that happened in many ways in the shock of the sacred losses of 9/11. And it's already receding. And so whereas people, especially skeptics, ironically dismiss, and Christians sometimes too, dismiss the subtle and growing worldview changes among people in moving back to their idiosyncratic religion that includes many of the elements disparaged or dismissed by New Atheism. The reason they're making these changes is evidentiary. They're making these changes because they're discovering that in the story of their lives, these questions work better. And they don't just work in terms of giving some sort of soft self-satisfaction. They work in terms of making them more generous towards their enemies, making them more generous towards their neighbors, making them better equipped to face death and the trials of life than they were before, delivering them from, let's say, the kinds of self-destruction that nihilism predictably puts into people. So, got to land the plane. Hopefully this playing around and doing this with StreamYard worked. I'll release this probably the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And so maybe for those of you in the United States, have a happy Thanksgiving. And if you've be grateful for whatever you have with whatever worldview you have, whatever religion you have. But if you have been given the gift of faith, be grateful for the faith that you've been given and the faith that you've been able to maintain. Because it is a good gift. And in my experience, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali probably looks back and says, boy, if I knew today what I knew back when I was running away from Islamism and embracing, at least in a shallow way, the religion of the West, and have now come to see it in a fuller, deeper, richer way. So if you have the gift of faith, be grateful for it. It's a precious, precious thing. Leave a comment.